Well, hello, this is Joe Walensky, and I'm the host of the Digital Accessibility Podcast, The People Behind the Progress. I'm here with another guest. Today, I am speaking with Samantha Karell. How are you doing today,
Hi,
Samantha?
Joe. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. How are you doing?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a dismal day in Bellingham, Washington. Where are you talking to us from?
I'm about 80 miles south of you in Seattle, so I suspect you and I have probably been sharing the same cloud the last couple of days.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll actually get summer soon, but
Yeah.
it's good to have you as part of this uh, program. And first thing would be to just hear a little bit about your work, the things that you're involved with now.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently, I'm leading digital accessibility services at Allyant. So there, I'm overseeing teams that are really spending a lot of time delivering accessibility evaluations, VPATs, doing a lot of client-facing consulting and strategic accessibility services, really to organizations across a lot of different industries. So the team that I lead, they're really helping organizations understand where accessibility barriers are existing in their digital environment. But I think more importantly, we're really trying to help the organizations that we work with build really sustainable programs and practices that help them really, I think, proactively think about accessibility and how to improve it over time. I am a little bit newer to the organization, so I'm still getting oriented to the day to day there. But I think what I've really loved about my role so far is that it really kind of overlaps with accessibility, customer experience, operations, and business strategy. And so it really feels like it's kind of drawing on a lot of areas of my professional history. And I think the other thing that I've really liked about it is that I think sometimes people think accessibility is primarily a technical or a compliance challenge. And I've learned through my career that it's often a little bit more holistic than that. And it's usually an organizational challenge. And so I think having an opportunity to be in a leadership position where I can think about governance, processes, priorities, and just how we proactively build accessibility into the way that companies are getting work done has been a really great opportunity for me.
Well, for people that may not be familiar with your organization, just tell us a little bit about what the company is involved in.
Yeah, so Alliant is a digital accessibility organization. So we're providing a variety of services to support organizations become more accessible. So I mentioned I oversee the digital audit side, so really kind of getting into organizations' environments and helping them understand where those barriers and blockers exist and how they can fix and ideally prevent them from coming up in the future. And then one of the things that's been really interesting about Alliant is it provides a host. We provide a host of accessibility service offerings. So things like remediation services, print and alternative format services, and even Braille services. Which is kind of a fun callback to some of the time I spent at the University of Washington, where we were involved in providing things like Braille textbooks to students or faculty. So, a lot of different accessibility services the organization is providing. I kind of like to think of it almost as like a full suite of offerings that you can explore if you work with the company.
And how did you find your way to where you are today? Maybe tell us a little bit. Well, you mentioned the University of Washington. Maybe just talk a little bit about your background and the path that led you to what you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. Accessibility really, I think, did come to me through higher education. I started my professional career working in student services, and I always felt really strongly about educational access and inclusion. And then while I was working in student services, I had the opportunity at the University of Washington in Seattle to start working for their Disability Resources Office. And I think that's really where I got my start in accessibility, as well as program management and service delivery. I think those three things have been kind of common connections throughout my professional career. And it's just such an amazing experience getting to work for disability resources between learning from the professionals that worked in that office and then certainly the students it served. I think really just kind of kicked off a passion for accessibility. While I was there, I was managing classroom access services and accommodations. And I think very typical of the higher education environment was just wearing a lot of hats. So, from managing classroom accommodations to testing support to things like department operations, staffing, and service delivery, kind of all fell under my wheelhouse there. I think at the time I was doing more work again around classroom access. So thinking about how do students get into the building? How do students get into the classroom? How do students engage in that environment? And one of my colleagues was focused a little bit more on the digital environment. So supporting students who needed materials in large print, Braille, or other accessible digital formats. And I think that was really the first time I really thought about access in the digital space. And it was really great learning from her because it just made me think about understanding accessibility beyond a physical classroom and into the digital environment. And I think that environment, the digital world has only become increasingly important since then. And, I think really that experience working at DRS at the University of Washington, it just fundamentally shaped how I think about accessibility today. And I think ensuring that students had equitable access to the same opportunities as everyone else has become, I think, kind of a guiding principle in the work that I do. And then I think the other thing that really kind of set me on the path that I'm on today was actually my graduate work. So while I was at the UW, I completed my graduate work in higher education administration. And one of the concepts that I really leaned into and I think had a really lasting impact as well on just kind of my approach to access and inclusion was universal design for learning. I think one of the things that really stood out about that was that it really challenges us. UDL really challenges us to think beyond just accommodations, which is not to say that accommodations aren't incredibly important, but they can be sometimes very reactive. They're often provided after someone is encountering a barrier. And I think universal design kind of makes us stop and ask a different question, which is how do we proactively design learning environments, systems, services, experiences, and so on in a way that supports a wide range of learners, including students with disabilities from a start? And I think that concept of how do we proactively design for this is something that has kind of followed me throughout my career, whether I'm working with a university, small business that's maybe just getting started after litigation, or a large Fortune 50 company that has a mature accessibility program. I think those experiences at the University of Washington and with universal design really, I think, caused me that kind of ask that same question is how do we create systems that really work to further accessibility for more people instead of constantly reacting to barriers after they appear?
Well, you definitely it sounds like you had a lot of great experience at the university, and that led you on to other things. There's certainly differences between academic and corporate environments. Did you find any challenges moving into the type of work that you're doing now?
It's been an interesting transition. I kind of eased into it a little bit. I think my first kind of real immersion into digital accessibility as a profession came when I joined Blackboard. I think they were known as Anthology for a little while, and I think they're back to Blackboard now. And I started working there as an accessibility consultant. And that was really eye opening for me because I was still working within higher education, but it was on a much bigger scale. I was really working with systems, university systems and colleges around the world to implement this very interesting tool called Blackboard Ally. And I think that was a really nice introduction for me. Ally was a tool that was very deeply rooted in universal design for learning principles. So it was helping institutions kind of identify barriers in course content while providing students alternative formats, things like audio versions of reference material, electronic braille, HTML or mobile format friendly formats. And I think really the goal there was to support different learning preferences and needs. And while I was there, something that really prepared me for that transition out of education and academia into kind of the more corporate world was that I was working with institutions that were at just totally different stages of their accessibility journey, which is something I have found moving more over to the corporate side. I would sometimes work with an institution that had, a single champion that was really, trying to move the work forward. And then other times I was working with a university or maybe an entire college system where it was really top down, the entire leadership that was pursuing accessibility as a strategic initiative. And I think that experience and something I took forward and, from that was just that accessibility, again, it's not just technology or compliance challenge. It's, really it can be a change management challenge. It can be a leadership or governance challenge. And it's really about meeting an organization at where they're at and kind of helping them mature in that. And so I think that is something that as I started working with all of these different businesses that were at different stages of their journey is something I've come back to is where is that organization? What are their accessibility goals and how do we help them start to achieve that in a way that feels both proactive and sustainable over time?
Well, you've mentioned, the perspectives that you've gotten from different clients that have different challenges that you have to help them with. I imagine that also there's so many things evolving in accessibility, new technologies that change things, new business realities that change. I was wondering if you have any thoughts in that area in terms of things that you've seen or learned from your clients or through your own team, of new changes that we have to be aware of as accessibility moves forward.
Yeah. I think when I first started in accessibility, it was a lot of times viewed as kind of this niche specialty. And so a lot of the conversations I was hearing were really happening among kind of this small group of disability services professionals or accessibility practitioners or, relatively small groups of advocates in the community. And I think it's been interesting to see that, as time has gone on, that conversation, it's become a much broader business conversation. And I'm starting to hear, and I think really the pandemic maybe accelerated the shift a little bit, but I think, in the last several years, it has been very cool to see how that conversation has expanded and it's becoming part of discussions around things like customer experience, product quality, risk management, even things like procurement or the employee experience. Companies are starting to think about accessibility and having awareness of that. It's really increased pretty dramatically. So I think what I'm seeing now, and I think this is a challenge that we're trying to solve, is now that we have awareness, how do we shift from knowing what the challenge is and knowing what the barriers are to actually operationalizing that and really kind of moving that forward. I think the question I hear, and I think this has again changed over time from organizations, they don't really need to be convinced why accessibility matters. It's not something that I'm really having to gain a lot of buy-in around. I think it's more, it's less of why should we do this, and then I think the conversation has shifted to how do we do this consistently. And so I think that's where I've been spending a lot of my time today is how do we move from good intentions to actual sustainable execution. And I think I think we have made a lot of progress, but I do think a lot of work still needs to happen on just making that move from reactive to proactive.
Yeah, I've that the last part you mentioned is something that I've mentioned on this program before, is that there are things that when I started working in accessibility 25 years ago, I assumed things would be a lot farther along in the future than they are now. And on the other hand, there's been some amazing developments that I never could have, imagined earlier on as well. So there's always that trade off.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's been really cool to see the conversation evolve. At the same times, it feels like we're sometimes running into the same stumbling blocks that we did, 10, 15 years ago. And I there are some organizations that are doing it really well. I think it's not as proactive as I would like it to be, but I am seeing some movement in, just bringing accessibility into product development or design systems or even organizational strategy. And I do think that the earlier that accessibility becomes a part of an organization's decision making, the greater impact that it has. And I also, I think something that I would often tell customers and still do, I think that a lot of times when people think of accessibility, they think that they have to go from 0 to 100. And I always say that it's progress, it's not perfection. One of the reasons I love this industry is it changes and it evolves so much. And we as practitioners get to change and evolve with it. And I think with that means that you're always learning something new. There's always something that you could be incorporating into your practice that's just come out. And so this idea that you're going to get to perfect out of the gate, I think can really trip a lot of organizations up. It's how do we make these small incremental changes that become practice over time?
Well, I'm sure you're always being kept busy with new and different things that are happening. Are there any things coming up in the near term or farther out that you're looking forward to? Are there any new challenges or opportunities that you're particularly excited or concerned about for you or your organization?
Yeah, I think this is probably not the first time you've heard this, but I think just the really big topic right now is AI and the role that that could play with accessibility. And it's something that I am very curious and I think cautiously optimistic about. I think something that I feel really passionately about is that I don't see AI replacing accessibility professionals. I certainly don't see it replacing the learned experiences of people with disabilities or native screen reader users. I think that that lived experience is really essential, but I am very curious to see how AI can maybe be almost an accelerator when it comes to fixing barriers in the environment, whether it's, how can we use this to identify patterns more quickly or provide more tangible or actionable guidance? How do we maybe use it to help scale some of our accessibility knowledge? So I think things like that, I'm really kind of curious to see how that can help as a tool within accessibility. I think to me, AI is a tool, maybe not a complete solution. And then I think, beyond how it can help with, things like accessibility audits, I think from a service delivery perspective, I'm also very intrigued around how AI can help us just continue to operationalize and scale out, whether it's things like forecasting, capacity planning, internal training and enablement, or just process efficiency. I think, one of the things that I focus a lot on is if my team can be, really, really efficient and really aligned, that means that we can get guidance, consultative experiences, feedback, recommendations back to customers more quickly. So I think that's something that, like everyone in the industry, we're kind of playing around with to see, again, how is this a tool that we can make work for us and for our customers?
Well, you're right that AI it has come up before. It definitely is
Yeah.
something that's the top of mind, and I think we're at the point where it's we're talking less about the idea of it. And over the past year, I've
Yeah.
seen and heard so many people talk about what they're actually doing, the solutions that they're producing, to be able to use that technology for the good and to move things forward.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see, I think, the creativity that some of our colleagues are leveraging when it comes to AI. And, I admit, I think this is where I have to take my own advice and stay open and stay curious to it. I think when the AI conversation came up, and I don't know if you heard this a lot, Joe, I think a lot of times it was getting positioned within the accessibility community as this total solution, something you could take and it was going to tell you where all of the barriers existed in your environment and help you fix that. And I do again think that there's a lot of validity that it can certainly again accelerate that, but I think over time we're seeing that it's not replacing people, it's just supporting the work that they're already doing.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm particularly interested in the kind of the new things that move us forward. Certainly, it's useful as a tool to help speed things up, but it's some of those innovative techniques that I kind of always looking out for because well, those are new things that hadn't been possible before or thought of before.
Yeah, yeah, and it is really cool to see. Some of my team has been kind of playing around with it and to see some of the potential that it has to, again, really get results or very tangible recommendations to customers more quickly, or even internal enablement. How do we take the knowledge and the expertise that exists across an accessibility team and go, okay, here's where we need to scale out, here's a trend that's coming within the community, like here's how we proactively as professionals and practitioners kind of get ahead of some of that, so we're providing the best guidance to customers. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it evolves over time.
Well, it's been great having this time to chat with you, Samantha. So I appreciate you taking the time to share some thoughts about your background and your own work. And yeah, I look forward to hopefully meeting you out in the real world at some point.
Absolutely, Joe, I really appreciate the time today. It was wonderful getting to talk with you.
All right, thanks a lot. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.